Good afternoon, guys. How you doing? I hope you're all good. Hope you're good. Pesach. Hope you're doing well this with the extended stay at home. We definitely all miss you all back here in Israel. Now that we're starting Kaitzman, we're gonna do the last four classes of our Rav Soloveitchik course. We're gonna do two classes on Kol Dodi Dofek, and then two classes on Tefillah. And I thought of Rav Soloveitchik, we were going to do them in the opposite order. I want to finish with Kol Dodi Dofek, but I think that was based on the idea that you would be going home after Kol Dodi Dofek, not already being home. So I think it doesn't have the same kick this way that I thought it would have had at the end of the year if you're going home. And then also, I just realized last week that this week is Yom HaShoah. It was 2 days before I'm recording this lecture. So it made a lot of sense to do Kol Dodi Dofek right now because it's in very large part responding to the Holocaust. And then the other part of it is responding to the modern state of Israel and how we should respond to it. And then I will do that next week when it's Yom HaZikaron Yom HaAtzmaut. So it made more sense to do that this week. And then we will end with Tefillah, two classes, the second of which will take us back to the Lonely Man of Faith, and then take us back as well to some of the themes we've been looking at in Halachic Man, and then again in Ubikash Mishaman from there you shall seek. And speaking of themes, I want to reiterate that the big theme we've been tracing since the very beginning of this year is the question of majesty and humility, the two aspects of man. Man is great, and man is weak, man is capable, and man fails. And that there's two themes show up throughout every single one of Rav Soloveitchik's works, different emphasis, sometimes emphasizing more the majesty, sometimes more emphasizing humility. So those two aspects are going to once again show up in Kol Dodi Dofek in this lecture Rav Soloveitchik gave in Yiddish for Yom HaAtzmaut. Eventually translated into both Hebrew and then eventually English. Two English translations. We're working off the 2006 translation by David Gordon. So we're gonna today talk about Theodicy and destiny. Theodicy is a fancy word meaning justifying God. It's dealing with the question of evil, which we'll see Rav Soloveitchik jumps into head first, and then takes a very interesting sort of twist on, which will take us into our discussion of destiny and what it means to live a life based on destiny, as opposed to what I was going to say about fate. We'll see next week. Rav Soloveitchik is not totally negative about fate. Instead, it's one of those classic dichotomies he likes to have. The Brisker Tzvei Din, there's two sides to everything. So for Rav Soloveitchik, it's going to be fate and destiny. And while he appreciates both of them, he certainly puts much more emphasis and importance on destiny the same way he appreciates both Adam the first and Adam the second in Lonely Men of Faith, but the emphasis is definitely on Adam the second. So, jumping right in, source number one, from relatively near the beginning of the book, he sort of lays out the setting for the lecture he gave. He said, we too are living in troubled times, in days of anger and distress. We have been afflicted with violent pogroms and become accustomed to suffering. In the past 15 years, meaning 1941-1956, we have undergone tortuous ideals that are unparalleled in thousands of years of diaspora, degradation, and destruction. This chapter of suffering did not end with the establishment of the State of Israel. So it's clear here there that he's invoking the Holocaust. Not just the Holocaust, he's invoking all of the sufferings of the entirety of the exile, and then also everything led up to the Holocaust, and also things that followed the Holocaust. The Holocaust, hard to say what it ended per se, but the war is generally thought to have ended in 1945. People were still in DP camps for a while, etc. The State of Israel established in 1948, but in some ways 1948 is just the beginning of trouble for Jews throughout the Arab world. And as he goes on, we're not going to look at this inside, but Rav Soloveitchik goes on to talk at length about how some ways with the state of Israel, anti-Semitism just shifted from focusing on Jews to focusing on the Jewish state, and that's present in terms of demonizing the Jewish state, but also just in terms of physically attacking Israel. We all had the benefit of growing up after the Six-Day War, when really, in many ways, attacking Israel and threatening Israel in a significant way stopped being a reality. The Yom Kippur War took everyone by surprise for that reason. But the Yom Kippur War, as traumatic as it was for Israel and as great a threat to Israel's security as it's often thought of, is anything a great success for Israel. It came out, was caught totally unawares, but came out with like more territory than it started with. It was by the measure of sort of politics and statehood, statecraft and warfare, it's a success. It was more of a cultural failure, and it really questioned a lot of the assumptions around Zionism and power and things. But Israel came out of it doing better. But regardless of whether it's militarily or otherwise, Rav Soloveitchik is arguing that, or talking about the way that the state of Israel did not stop the attacks on Jews. It maybe simply changed the form of some of them. So the problem that we're going to look at a little bit is the sort of driving impulse of the book Kol Dodi Dofek is bad things happen in the world, and specifically bad things happen to Jews. And we're going to talk a little bit about what's the theological problem there. And Rav Soloveitchik starts to touch on that here in source number 2. It says, one of the deepest of mysteries troubling Judaism from the dawn of its existence is the problem of suffering. Why and wherefore are hardships visited on man? Why and wherefore do the righteous suffer and evildoers prosper? From that wondrous morning when Moses, the faithful shepherd, communed with the Creator of the universe and pleaded for the comprehensive solution to this question of questions, throughout the generations, the prophets and sages of Israel have grappled with this conundrum. Habakkuk demanded satisfaction for this affront to justice. Jeremiah, King David in his Psalms, and Solomon in Ecclesiastes all pondered this problem. The book of Job is totally dedicated to this ancient riddle that still hovers over our world and demands its own resolution. You'll note that Job actually gets thoroughly explored in a chapter in this book that we're not going to look at. So look at the riddle that demands its own resolution. Why does the Holy One, blessed be He, permit evil to have dominion over His creatures? Right. So the problem of evil is a problem for everyone who's alive. Why are there bad things in the world? But in some sense, Rav wants to emphasize it's a harder problem for monotheists to answer. Right? If you don't believe in God, or you believe in multiple competing and fighting gods, it's really easy to understand why bad things happen. But when done properly, monotheism should just add another layer of trouble to the problem of evil. It shouldn't make you deny evil. You shouldn't say, oh, but God is in control of everything, and therefore evil and suffering aren't real. It's an impossible answer, but it's not a real answer. The real answer says, okay, but I experience suffering. So now I have to answer not just why are bad things happening, but I have to answer why is God making or letting bad things happen. This is what Rav Soloveitchik is getting at in with the famous footnote 4 in Halachic Man. Footnote 4 is a lengthy essay of its own, lengthy footnote exploring the idea that monotheism, religion in general, is not about peace and tranquility. It's not there to make life easier. It's not, as Marx is famously taken to have said, the opiate of the masses. Something there to calm us down and make us almost sedated is a thing of trouble and struggle and strife and emotional turmoil. And part of that is because of this, is because in some sense, God, one of the roles God plays in the life of the believer is that it ensures everything is meaningful, right? God can explain, or God gives a reason for everything and makes everything meaningful. But when you encounter something like suffering that is definitionally not meaningful, it's just this bad thing is happening, then not only do you have to deal with that, you have the additional problem of the guarantor of meaning, the thing that my whole life in some sense is based on or based around is failing. It's not doing what it's supposed to do, and why not? What's happening? Why is God failing to be God in some sense? So that's the problem that Rav Soloveitchik is going to launch into. We're going to look essentially, fairly briefly, his critique or his discussion of it, because his discussion of it is going to be, I think, in some sense, short and unsatisfying. In some ways, that's almost the point, and is itself not even really meant to be a resolution, so much as the jumping off point for the larger discussion of destiny we'll then turn to. Source number 3, he says, Judaism, with its realistic approach to man and his status within existence, understood that evil does not lend itself to being obscured and glossed over, and that every attempt to diminish the import of the contrast and cleavage in existence will not bring man to inner peace or to comprehension of the existential secret. Evil is a fact that cannot be denied. There is evil in the world. There are suffering and agony and death pangs. He who would deceive himself by ignoring the split in existence and by romanticizing life is but a fool and a fabricator of illusions. It is impossible to conquer monstrous evil with philosophical speculative thought. Thus, Judaism determined that man, submerged in the depths of a frozen fate, will in vain seek the solution to the problem of evil in the context of speculative thought, for he will never find it. Right, so the first bit he said here is that evil is real. There is real suffering in the world. And no amount of saying, okay, well, God made it this way, this is God's will, can ever stop it from being bad. Evil and bad are real human experiences we should not be attempting to deny. And therefore, he said that Judaism says you will always in vain attempt to seek the problem of evil in kind of speculative thought. Thinking can never actually overcome the real experience of evil. That's why he continues, certainly the testimony of the Torah regarding creation, that it is very good, is true. However, this is only stated from the unbounded perspective of the Creator. In man's fine, limited view, the absolute good in creation is not apparent. The contrast is striking and undeniable. There is evil that is not susceptible to explanation and comprehension. Only by comprehending the world in its totality can man gain insight into the essence of suffering. However, as long as man's perception is limited and fragmented so that he only sees isolated portions of the cosmic drama and mighty saga of history, he cannot delve into the recesses of evil and the mystery of suffering. To what might this situation be compared? To a person who views a beautiful tapestry, the work of a fine artisan, which contains woven into it on its front a representation dazzling to the eye. To our great sorrow, we see this image in the world from the obverse side, from the back of the tapestry. Can such a sight become a sublime aesthetic experience? Thus, we are incapable of comprehending the panorama of reality without which one cannot uncover God's master plan, the essence of the works of the Holy One. Right, so he says the problem is one of perspective, and he's here going to say that on some level there might be a meaning to suffering. Suffering might be meaningful, but only from God's perspective. Only if you can see the whole picture. And we, because we live within the world, are created to live in our own very small context, we can never see the whole picture. And he then gives a metaphor of a tapestry, about a question of which side of the tapestry you can see. If you've ever seen the back of something that has a intricate embroidery on it, the back is just nonsense. It's just strings going all over the place. Hard to tell what the pattern's supposed to be, even when the strings are in the same place on both sides. It's just totally nonsense. And then you look at the front of it, like, oh, they actually made a really beautiful picture there. So in that metaphor, God stands on the front, so you're able to see the whole tapestry, and we stand in the back, you can't see it. In some ways, I would go maybe even farther than Rav Soloveitchik and say that meaning is always relative. So even if something's meaningful to God, it won't be meaningful to us. And I think this is somehow inherent in what Rav Soloveitchik is saying, that God created us with human limited understanding, that we were meant to not understand all of it. And God created us to not understand all of it. and in the absolute good in creation is not apparent. I don't even know what it would mean to have God's perspective, but it's not something we as humans are capable of doing. There are things that can never ever be meaningful to us because they're simply not something that would be meaningful to a person. As long as we're people, there are aspects of creation that will be meaningless and simply experience the suffering. Particularly at this moment in time, um, that can seem very depressing. Terrible things are raging the world over, and it would be nice and comforting at some level to be able to say, okay, but they're happening because X, Y, or Z. Obviously, so many different religious leaders, rabbis, but also from other religions have given reasons. What is the thing people have done wrong that has led to this? What is this? Why is God doing this? But it's just not something that all of those are attempting to come up with human answers when the meaning could only be found from a divine perspective. So Rav Soloveitchik is instead going to pivot um, toward the what we call destiny as opposed to fate. Destiny is going to be looking for a human solution or human action in response to this problem, as opposed to trying to find the divine meaning for it. And looking for the divine meaning, he's going to say falls under the category of fate, which he says in the last line of source number 3 here. In short, the eye of fate, the nature of a person who subjects himself to fate, asks a speculative, metaphysical question about evil. And this question is not given to solution and has no answer. Right? There is no answer to the question of why bad things happen because the question always looks for a human answer, and there's just not one. There is some form of coherence or goodness or meaning from the divine perspective, but there's nothing that could possibly be relevant or understandable to humans that would possibly be sufficient to answer the question of why do bad things happen, why are bad things happening. So we're going to continue in a second with the source number 5 in the second half of this year about destiny. But first I want to note for a second, I've put here source number 4 from a essay by Rav Shagar about the drasha for Yom HaShoah, for Holocaust Remembrance Day, talking about God in the Holocaust, but invoking the Zohar. The Zohar talks about that which comes before God in some sense. The Zohar calls it Reshit de lo Ichida, Distimta de lo Ichida, that's it, Distimta de lo Ichida, the concealed and unknown, which in some sense came before God and created God. God as we know God is secondary, develops out of and is created by something that is inherently unknowable, and it is in fact a higher revelation of God in the Holocaust, the revelation of just God beyond any thing capable of appearing to humans. That the lower manifestation that we call God, that we call Akim, is something already very human in many ways. And so, in some ways, it's very similar to what Rav Soloveitchik was saying, that both of them say evil on some level, whether general suffering or specifically suffering on the scale of the Holocaust, are somehow outside of the realm of human comprehension. They use very different sort of language for it. Rav Soloveitchik invokes this very existential language. Rav Shagar uses postmodern terms, and this passage uses the word differend from the French philosopher Jean-Paul Lyotard, something Lyotard, 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 which means that the thing that can't be included within our language, that is, that we're saying we just don't have language for talking about. And one of the things Lyotard talks about is Holocaust survivors, because The story we tell about the Holocaust means there should be no survivors. And so that story doesn't allow for there to be people afterwards still telling their story. They fall into a sort of gap in the story itself. And that's what enables the existence of Holocaust deniers, because they can say, okay, you must be lying about something, because otherwise you wouldn't be here telling this story. Sort of chilling form of perfect crime. Perfect crime, Lyotard says, is not when you've gotten away with it because you've covered every detail. It's when you've made it so horrible that no one believes the witnesses. So in contrast to that sort of discussion about just the way the Holocaust and any sort of theology about the Holocaust must by definition be outside of human conversation, and Rav Soloveitchik is very explicit. He said, I will conclude by posing these questions at the end of the passage I've given you. Instead of that sort of silent and almost stuckness, Rav Soloveitchik wants to pivot away from those sort of questions about God and the divine towards questions of the human and what meaning could there possibly be in the human realm, as opposed to asking what meaning there is or was in the divine realm. Question number 5, Rav Soloveitchik says, posing the question of suffering, claims Judaism, is possible in two separate dimensions. You can ask, why do bad things happen in two ways? The dimension of fate and the dimension of destiny. Judaism has always distinguished between the existence of fate and the existence of destiny, between the I, which is the progeny of fate, and the I, which is the child of destiny. In this distinction lies hidden the Jewish doctrine of suffering. What is an existence of fate? It is an existence of duress, and the nature of against your will do you live. It is a factual existence, simply one line in a long chain of mechanical causality, devoid of significance, direction, and purpose, and subordinate to the forces of the environment into whose midst the individual is pushed unconsulted by providence. The I of fate emerges as an object which, as an object, man appears as acted upon and not as actor. He is acted upon through his passive collision with the objective outside, as one object confronting another. The I of fate is hurled into a sealed dynamic that is always turned outward. Man's existence is hollow, lacking inner content, substance, and independence. The I of fate denies itself completely, because the sense of selfhood and objectification cannot dwell in tandem. So there are two ways of being in the world, two forms of existence, and thus two ways of asking the question, why do bad things happen? And the first, an existence of fate. And I'll note here, but the original translation by Professor Lawrence Kaplan, edited by Rabbi Dr. Walter Wurzberger. The original translation of this into English was called Fate and Destiny. This is one of perhaps the most critical distinction in this book. Not the only dichotomy of terms. We're going to look at another one next week, but it's perhaps the most critical one in the book. And that was what they called it. And fate means passivity, but not even passivity out of choice. I mean, sense of passivity where you feel like, oh, I couldn't do anything. Things just happen to me. I'm not the one who does things. I am on the receiving end of actions. In terms of the question of why do bad things happen, that question is in some sense assumes a fate posture. Right? The question, why do bad things happen, is not a question wherein I could do anything, where I have done anything. Right? It's not why am I doing things, why are things, or why do they look like it? There's the why question assumes this thing outside myself, assumes a given way things are that I want to explain, right? This thing happened and I want to explain it. But the other way of talking about the things that happen to us, we're going to see in a second, could be what do I do next? How do I respond to these things, right? Questions that focus on me and my own response, or the reality outside me, taking the reality outside me as unchangeable and fixed and something that happens to me. The existence of fate is when things happen to me, I have no effect on them. So in a sense, all I can do is ask, why are these things happening? Because I have no way of responding to them. I am a passive object. I myself am something that happened, that I was created. I don't live actively. And so Rav Soloveitchik wants us to recognize that form of existence, and it's going to become more important later in some ways. We'll talk about that next week. That the existence of being someone who things happen to, but the key way of living and way of talking about bad things happening, Rav Soloveitchik, is an existence of destiny. It's an existence of I do things. Source number 6. What is an existence of destiny? It's an active existence. When man confronts the environment into which he has been cast with an understanding of his uniqueness and value, freedom and capacity, without compromising his integrity and independence in his struggle with the outside world. The slogan of the Eye of Destiny is, against your will you are born, against your will you die, but by your free will do you live. And this is playing the same mission as before. Man is born as an object, dies an object, but is within his capability to live as a subject, as a creator and innovator who impresses his individual imprimatur on his life and breaks out of life an instinctive and automatic behavior into one of creative activity. According to Judaism, man's mission in this world is to turn fate into destiny, an existence that is passive and influenced into an existence that is active and influential, an existence of compulsion, perplexity, and speechlessness into an existence full of will, vision, and initiative. The blessing of the Holy One to his creation fully defines man's role. Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it. Conquer the environment and subjugate it. If you do not rule over it, it will enslave you. Destiny bestows on man a new status in God's world. It bestows upon man a royal crown, and thus he becomes God's partner in the work of creation. Right? The existence of destiny could not be farther from the existence of fate. The existence of fate is about being passive, about being something created and something given, and not something active. So being a creator, a creature, as opposed to the existence of destiny, to being a creative force in the world, a partner in creation, someone who acts and does things. Instead of asking, why did this thing happen, you say, how do I want things to look? What can I do to change things? How should I respond to what happens? It means recognizing that you said, against your will you are born, and against your will you die. There are bad things happening to you. Well, that doesn't mean you just accept them. It doesn't mean you just say, okay, well, that's it then. They rule my life. Your life is ruled by no one but you. You always have a choice, to the point where when you don't make a choice, that itself is something you've chosen. You ultimately choose to be an object, and you must, in some sense, recognize that we are, to use the word destined, we are destined to choose. We're always destined to choose. So the answer is to choose destiny, to choose to think consciously about things that happen to us and how we want things to look and how we can respond to them. And only that way to become God's partner in creation. So Rav Soloveitchik goes on to address how this responds to the problem of evil. As stated above, in man's existence of destiny arises a new relation to the problem of evil. As long as man vacillates goes back and forth in his fateful existence, his relationship to evil is expressed solely in a philosophical speculative approach. Right? As long as you can't do anything to change what's happening, all you can do is ask why. As a passive creature, it was not within his power to wrestle with evil in order to contain or to exploit it for an exalted purpose. The child of fate is devoid of the ability to determine anything in the realm of his existence. He is nurtured from the outside, and his life bears its imprint. Therefore, he relates to evil from an impractical perspective and philosophizes about it from a speculative point of view. He wishes to deny the reality of evil and create a harmonistic outlook on life. The result of such an experience is bitter disappointment. Evil mocks the prisoner of fate in his fantasy of reality that all is good and pleasant. The ultimate goal of questions about why are bad things happening is to feel like you could understand them. And on some level, if you could understand them, they wouldn't really be evil. They wouldn't be meaningless suffering. But also, insists, we will always experience them as suffering, because on some level we are experiencing beings as much, if not more, than we are thinking beings. And it doesn't matter how much you think about them. You could think about them till you've somehow made them totally transparent to your thought processes. They make total sense, but they would never manage to fully explain the experience of suffering. Um, that's a fantasy. However, in the realm of destiny, man recognizes reality as it is and does not desire to use harmonizing formulas in order to hide and disregard evil. The child of destiny is very realistic and does not flinch in anticipation of a face-to-face confrontation with evil. His approach is halachic and moral and is devoid of any metaphysical speculative nuance. When the child of destiny suffers, he says in his heart, there is evil. I do not deny it, and I will not conceal it with fruitless casuistry, with meaningless discussion. I am, however, interested in it from a halachic point of view, and as a person who wants to know what action to take, I ask a single question: what should the sufferer do to live with his suffering? Right? We're no longer asking, why did this happen? What is the reason for this? Asking, what should I do now? What next? In this dimension, the emphasis is removed from causal and teleological considerations, which differ only as to direction. Causal is what's the cause that lay behind it that made it happen. Teleological is what's the end goal for which it was done. And is directed to the realm of action. The problem, just you give an example of causal versus teleological. The cause of a baseball flying through the air is that I threw it. The goal of it, the teleology, is trying to get it into the catcher's mitt behind and thereby strike out the batter. The problem is now formulated in the language of a simple halacha and revolves around a quotidian and daily task. The question of questions, what does suffering obligate man to do? This problem was important to Judaism, which placed it at the center of its Weltanschauung, its worldview. From the German Welt, world, and Schauung, seeing, the Weltanschauung worldview. Halacha is just as interested in this question as in issues of Isur and Heter and Chiyuv and Patur. We do not wonder about the ineffable ways of the Holy One, but instead ponder the paths man must take when evil leaps up at him. We ask not about the reason for evil and its purpose, but rather about its rectification and uplifting. How should a man react in time of distress? What should a person do so as not to rot in his affliction? The halachic answer to this is very simple. Suffering comes to elevate man, to purify him and sanctify his spirit. Purify his spirit and sanctify him, to cleanse his mind and purify it from the chaff of superficiality and the dross of crudeness, to elevate it, to sensitize his soul and expand his horizons. In general, the purpose of suffering is to repair the imperfection of man's persona. Halacha teaches us that an afflicted person commits a criminal act if he allows his pain to go for naught and to remain without meaning or purpose. Suffering appears in the world in order to contribute something to man, in order to atone for him, in order to redeem him from moral impurity, from crudeness and lowliness of spirit. The sufferer must arise therefrom, purified and refined and cleansed. From the midst of suffering itself, he will achieve lasting redemption and merit a self-actualization and exaltation that are unequaled in the world devoid of suffering. From negation sprouts affirmation. From antithesis, thesis emerges. From a denial of existence, a new existence is revealed, right? We're going for something bad happening and not exploring why did that bad thing happen, but we're taking a step forward to create something new. The Torah gave witness to man's mighty spiritual reaction to suffering inflicted upon him when it said, in your distress, when all these horrors shall come upon you, then you shall return to the Lord your God. Suffering requires man to repent and return to God. Distress is designated to arouse us to repentance. And what is repentance if not the renewal of and supreme redemption of man? Right, Rav Soloveitchik is saying that when bad things happen, those should spur us to new activities. And on some level, you might say, well, isn't that just asking the question of why do bad things happen? And we're like, what's the sin that I did that I should be fixing? But for Soloveitchik, I think it matters less the question of objectively, what is the reason why this happened? What is the sin that I did that I need to fix? So much as, no, there is a way I should be living. I'm aware there's a way I should be living. I should be following the Torah. And God, I'm not saying God did it because I'm not following the Torah. But when bad things happen to me, they should in some ways remind me that I should be living consciously and living actively and by choice, and choosing to live my life the way I know I should be living it, and living up to the standards that I believe in. That tshuva, as a response to suffering, is not an attempt to alleviate suffering. It's an attempt to live the way that I'm supposed to live. And I note here that something of an ambiguity in Rav Soloveitchik about what's the proper response to evil. Is it to do tshuva, to do a better job of living up to the standards of the Torah, the standards by which I believe I should live, or is it to alleviate evil? There's a lengthy discussion in Lowly Man of Faith, particularly one of the footnotes, about the capacity of the human to make himself better, to solve suffering. Right? He talks about how the brute is not dignified. We looked at this in the second class on Lowly Man of Faith. The brute is not dignified until he can, make hospitals and cure himself and build society. That the Adam 1, which is a way God told man to exist in the world, is someone who can solve evil when it happens and defeat evil and overcome evil. Really, some very powerful language in that footnote about the ability to overcome evil by curing suffering, and how the Midrash says, the Torah gave permission to man to heal things, to heal himself. And on some level, there's lots of similarities between Adam the first and the destiny model of Rav Soloveitchik in Kol Dodi Dofek. They're both about living an active life and a sort of dominating life and life in control, and where you take control of your destiny, or take control of the things that happen to you, etc. At the end of this passage I read, source number 7, he seems to suggest that the response might be, even though there are passages in Kol Dodi Dofek that read a lot like the passage about Adam the first and women of faith, but this one he was talking about like dafka religious response instead of responding by solving the problem, but respond by living an active, conscious life, an intentional life, living according to the standards I set for myself. Because really, the reason we don't live up to our standards is not because we have different standards. More often than not, it's simply because we're human and we fail to, and we get stuck in routines that are substandard and b'diavad, they're not ideal. And when bad things happen, it should be as the Rambam talks about the shofar, uru yishonim. It's a call for those who are slumbering to wake. And we should take evil and suffering as similar sort of wake-up calls. Source number 8. If we want to ask a penetrating question at a time beset by terrifying nightmares, it is incumbent upon us to do so in a halachic mode. And I'll note that as we talked about as we saw in the last source you're seeing here, Rav Soloveitchik is reiterating his constant theme of really all of Judaism is halacha. It's just everything is halachic. Always is telling us some sort of norm and rule of behavior. What obligation accrues to the sufferer as a result of his suffering? What commanding heavenly voice breaks through from the midst of suffering? As we said, this question has a solution which is expressed in a simple halacha. There is no need for metaphysical speculation in order to clarify the rules of rectifying evil, for it is not in heaven. If we succeed in formulating this doctrine without dealing with questions of cause and telos, we will earn a complete salvation. The scriptural promise will be fulfilled for us, right? Salvation comes from not asking why did this happen, but instead is saying how should I respond? As is written, take counsel together and it shall come to naught, speak your harshnesses and they shall not come to fruition, for God is with us. Then and only then shall we emerge from the depths of the Holocaust with enhanced spiritual nature and augmented historical splendor, as it is written, and the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before, double in quantity and quality. When the doctrine of the corrective effect of suffering is put into practice, it demands of the sufferer courage and spiritual discipline. He must gird himself with extraordinary strength, make a detached assessment of his world, and examine his past and look to his future with complete honesty. And we too, who are soft-hearted, weak-willed, bound by fate, and devoid of spiritual strength, are now bidden by Providence to adopt a new attitude, to ascend and raise ourselves to the level of to a level where suffering teaches us to demand from ourselves redemption and deliverance. For this purpose, we must look at our reflection with spiritual fortitude and pure objectivity. This reflection bursts through to us from both the present and the past. Right. So here again, a little ambiguous what kind of response is demanded for us, but the response of actively choosing to live our lives where we think we should be living it, whether that means solving the problem of evil, to give an example from our immediate situation, to stay home, to wear masks, to do everything we can to keep ourselves and those around us healthy, and keep people in our society healthy. That's one way of thinking about it, and I mean we could even frame that as a religious response in terms of the obligation of pikuach nefesh, and to protect other people, but also by davening and making sure that even though we cannot go to minyan, we're still doing the best we can to daven, or we found solutions like here in Israel, there's very common balcony minyanim where you're really nowhere near the other person, as opposed to like having a minyan in an open space, but you're also still sort of standing together. But either way, whether it's through practical action or religious action, ritual action, the Rav Soloveitchik is saying we redeem ourselves by choosing to live an active life, by living a life where we figure out not why things happen, but what we can do next and what we should do next, and we do it. Source number 9. Let us return to what we said above. How does destiny differ from fate? In 2 respects. Fate means a compelled existence. Destiny is existence by volition, right? Fate is when I live a life just almost like a cog in a much larger machine, or like a marble that someone has pushed, and I'm just going wherever the road takes me. Destiny means being the person pushing the marbles. Destiny is created by man himself, who chooses and makes his own way in life. Fate is expressed in a teleological sense, in a denuded existence where destiny embodies purpose and objectives. Once again, purpose and objectives might be the most important words in that. Life in general. Is to find what you think you need to be doing, what you should be doing, why you should be doing it. And if you can clarify those things, those are the first step to living a life of destiny, living an active life, an intentional life, a life where you're not stuck with bad things happening to you. You have to just ask, why do they happen? But where you really get to be able to set some degree of standards for what happens and what's happening and why. And the meaning of what happens, you can in a sense decide what things mean. And I would note that I guess in some level I'm not as confident or optimistic as Rav Soloveitchik is about the amount of control we have over lives and the amount of power we have to decide our fates. But also outside that, we're going to next week talk more about the importance and persistence of an existence of fate. Rav Soloveitchik is going to talk about the ways in which we can never really escape a fate existence entirely, and therefore we should take the sort of destiny, active, intentional existence as a goal and an ideal, but one that's always going to be in back and forth with fate. Last source quickly. In short, man must solve not the question of the causal or teleological reason for suffering with all its speculative complexity, rather the question of its curative role in all its halachic simplicity, by turning fate to destiny and elevating himself from object to subject, from thing to man. With that, I wish you a Shabbat Shalom. I hope you're doing well, and I will see you, as it were, next week in a lecture on fate and destiny and the camp and the congregation after Yom HaTzmaut.